I have to ask you a question before I do this segment. And this segment is not going to be easy. I have to know something right now about this audience. Whether you are new to the program, listening for the first time, flipping the stations, or you listen to this program on a regular basis. People who subscribe to the content newsletter, who mention me in tweets or whatever. I just need to know something right now. How much of an attention span do you have at this moment? Because I went back and forth with what I want to do for this segment over and over in my head. I sat home last night reading so much for this segment that I'm probably going to pack too much into it, and it's going to get a tad boring for some of you who I don't know. If you have an attention span, I want you to stick with me. I filled my head last night with information on the Khmer Rouge, on the guy who named himself Pol Pot. You've heard that name before. You've heard Khmer Rouge time and time again. When you hear people say Nazi, fascist, tyrant, you hear stories about Mao Zedong, you hear stories about Che Guevara, you hear stories about Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin. The thing that separates Pol Pot from the rest of them is Pol Pot lived through much of the 90s. What took place in the killing fields, what the Khmer Rouge instituted as a government, there are still people alive who can tell you about it. Certainly in Miami, there are elder Cubans who remember Fidel, but they were probably children at this point. I mean, you're talking over 50 years ago. Certainly there are Holocaust survivors, far and few between, but they were also children at the time. There are people who watched in horror what took place in Cambodia in the 1970s. Where did Pol Pot learn what he attempted to institute as a form of government? Where did he learn it? Does anyone know where he learned it? What his name Pol Pot means? It's a political phrase in French. He learned about socialism and communism as a young man studying in France. Has anyone ever heard the phrase, the Great Leap Forward? Has anyone heard the phrase, the shining path? Jokingly, I've been playing this clip of audio from the Golden Girls from about 25 years ago. I'm not going to play it now. Where one of the characters, a communist, says to Dorothy, I know this sounds like a joke. I'm gonna set up something here. If you're the type of person that records this program, so you could discuss it with other people who might not be into politics as much as you, this is going to be one of those segments, and possibly into the next segment, where the character says, "Look at all these books, all these ideas. It'll lead to anarchy. If there's only one path, nobody gets lost." This whole concept of the Great Leap Forward and the singular path is what leads people into bondage. And the singular path was something that Mao believed in, Hitler believed in, Stalin believed in, Lenin believed in, Che believed in. I want you to hear this, and I'm not trying to freak you out with this. And I brought some literature with me to go back into history to cite. So none of what I'm going to say sounds unresearched or a shot from the hip or some wild conspiracy theory. And everything I'm going to give you can be verified and will be in the content newsletter at the end of the program. Headline, Reuters. Listen to this very, very carefully. Al-Qaeda, Arab revolts herald great leap forward. Al-Qaeda's most influential English-language preacher said revolts sweeping the Arab world would help rather than harm its cause, giving Islamists freed from tyranny greater scope to speak out. Western and Arab officials say the example set by young Arabs seeking peaceful political change is a counterweight to Al-Qaeda's push for violent militancy and weakens its argument that democracy and Islam are incompatible. But an Al-Qaeda preacher, and you've heard this name before, Anwar al-Awlaki, in an article published online Tuesday, said the removal of anti-Islamist autocrats meant Islamic fighters and scholars were now free to discuss and organize. Quote, our Mujahideen brothers in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and the rest of the Muslim world will get a chance to breathe again after 3 decades of suffocation, he wrote, using a term that refers to general Islamic guerrilla groups or holy warriors. Quote, for the scholars and activists of Egypt to be able to speak again freely, it would represent a great leap forward for the Mujahideen, wrote Awlaki, an American of Yemeni origin who's believed to be hiding in southern Yemen. What does that mean, the great leap forward? That was a phrase of Chairman Mao. I have with me Chairman Mao's little red book. I'm going to read directly from it so you can understand what is meant by the great leap forward. This sounds, and this is what makes me think that progressives who flippantly use words that they don't know the meaning of. This is what makes me think that progressives who just use words, buzzwords, are more dangerous than some of the scholars and fighters and politicians who are trying to put the world on a single path. Because ultimately, what is hoped for is that the people will vote them into power. A democratic uprising. If you don't think there are people around the world who think a democratic uprising is always a good thing, you're crazy. We have a generation of people in the United States who are insulated by academic ignorance, and yet they're referred to as smart, as bright, as educated, and they go on TV and they write columns and they write books and they write blogs, and they're called to guest lecture, and they sit on symposiums, and they interchange buzzwords. They speak in just predictable combinations of buzzwords and pejoratives and malevolent accusations against people who think like me. Here's the first portion I want to read to you from Mao's Little Red Book. The socialist system will eventually replace the capitalist system. This is an objective, law independent of man's will. However much the reactionaries try to hold back the wheel of history, sooner or later revolution will take place and inevitably triumph. We communists never conceal our political views. Definitely and beyond all doubt, our future or maximum program is to carry China forward to socialism and communism. Both the name of our party and our Marxist world outlook unequivocally point to this supreme ideal, the future, a future of incomparable brightness and splendor. I won't deny that passionate Marxist, Marx was no poet. I won't deny that he didn't inspire passionate people who were poetic in their language to give the belief that this is going to be a beautiful thing. Pol Pot was poetic. and he murdered 35 plus million. They'll never know how many people he killed. Nobody will ever. The death toll from Mao is upwards at 65 million people. How many people died in the Holocaust? Cuba was a tiny island. How many people, percentage-wise, died at the hands of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara? My God, Latin American and South American countries? The death toll, nobody knows the real truth about the death tolls. People used to disappear off the streets of Chile, never to be seen again. In Cuba, the quote-unquote ladies in white still march. The way we have POW MIA flags in the United States for prisoners of war missing in action, people who have not been accounted for from the Vietnam War, which ended almost 40 years ago. The ladies in white still march in Havana, wanting to know where their fathers and their brothers and their husbands are, because nobody knows. The media is controlled by the state. The death toll of the state isn't enumerated because the media isn't allowed to account for it, nor does it wish to. On the freedom of speech, Mao writes, I'm going someplace with this. You have to understand what the great leap forward is. Our state is a people's democratic dictatorship led by the working class and based on the worker, a peasant alliance. What is this dictatorship for? Its first function is to suppress the reactionary class and elements and those exploiters in our country who resist socialist revolution. To suppress these who try to wreck our socialist construction, or in other words, to resolve the internal contradictions between ourselves and the enemy. For instance, to arrest and try and sentence certain counter-revolutionaries and to deprive landlords and bureaucrat capitalists of their right to vote and their freedom of speech. For a specified scope of art, wasn't it Frank Lautenberg who just said the other day that Republicans should not be entitled to constitutional freedoms? These thoughts seep in. Maybe not in total, but they seep in, and they're seeping in here in the United States. They're seeping into the House. They're seeping into the Senate. They're steeped in the White House. Remember, it was Anita Dunn, Obama's former Deputy Assistant Communications Director, who said Mao Zedong was her favorite philosopher. To maintain public order and safeguard the interests of the people, it is likewise necessary to exercise dictatorship over embezzlers, swindlers, arsonists, murderers, criminal gangs, and other scoundrels. The second function of this dictatorship is to protect our country from the subversion and possible aggression by external enemies. And in that event, it is the task of this dictatorship to resolve the external contradiction between ourselves and the enemy. The aim of this dictatorship is to protect all of our people, that they can devote themselves to peaceful labor and build China into a socialist country, a modern industry, agriculture, science, and culture. You got to understand this is all translated from Chinese. The people's democratic dictatorship needs the leadership of the working class, for it is the only working class that is the most far-sighted, most selfless, and most hismoost throughout history. I don't even know what the hell that is. Himstoost, it says. Hismtoost. I'll admit that's a word I don't know. The entire history of revolution proves that without the leadership of the working class, revolution fails, and that with the leadership of the working class, revolution. I have one more here. One more passage, and then I have to move on to Thomas Paine, Rights of Man, where he lays out the three forms of government that exist in the world. And you will find that two of those three are malevolent. And it's the combination of the two of those three that we're seeing. Islam is about submission. It is about a single path of law under the guise of religion. Paine writes that there's a second form of government, which is one of brutal force. The third is one that grows out of society. But he's one of the people that wrote about church and state. Not the so-called separation of church and state. Not the separation of people who believe in God and their activities from the public square. Having an official religion of government like Islam. The reason why far left-wing progressives like what they see is that they see another group of people who believe in a single path, a great leap forward. And the enemy of my enemy is what? My friend. Under the headline, The Mass Lane. The people and the people alone are the motive force in the making of world history. The masses are the real heroes, while we ourselves are often childish and ignorant, and without the understanding, it is impossible to acquire even the most rudimentary knowledge. The masses have boundless creative power. They can organize themselves and concentrate on places and branches of work where they give full play to their energy. They can concentrate on production in breadth and depth and create a more and more undertakings for their own well-being. The present upsurge of the peasant movement is a colossal event. In a very short time, China and central, southern, and northern provinces, several 100 million peasants will rise like a mighty storm, like a hurricane, a force so swift and violent that no power, however great, will be able to hold it back. They will smash all the trammels that bind them and rush forward along the road to liberation. They will sweep all of the imperialists, warlords, corrupt officials, local tyrants, and evil gentry, that's the rich, into their graves. Every revolutionary party and every revolutionary comrade will be put to the test to be accepted or rejected as they decide. There are three alternatives: to march at their head and to lead them, to trail behind them, gesticulating and criticizing, or to stand in their way and oppose them. Every Chinese is free to choose, but events will force you to make the choice quickly. You like what you hear there? This is not, all revolutions aren't the same. The American Revolution was to throw off the weight of tyranny. There's a reason why the Constitution creates a Republican form of government, where a 51% majority selects the leadership, but the leadership cannot act without the consent of the governed. Meaning, for federal law to be legitimate, it requires 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, 3/4 of the states. That is the Constitution. The reason that was put in place was to stave off what we call tyranny of the majority. Mao is calling for that, and violently, I might add. That was the great leap forward that brought about the single path or the shining path. This is what Al-Qaeda is calling for. There will be peace once everyone submits to Islam. There will be peace once all of the capitalists or the bureaucrats or the counter-revolutionaries have been put in their grave and everybody is on one single socialist path. What Pol Pot did, which failed miserably, which is what led to the killing fields, was he decided everybody had to work in the fields to produce food, yet they still ended up with shortages. And when the people questioned the wisdom, he killed them. 1-866-95 Patriot. I'll reset this, and then I will give you some quotations from The Rights of Man by Thomas Paine. I don't know how much patience you have. I don't know how much of an attention span you have, but this is the stuff that you must hear. We are right. They are wrong. That's the end of the story. The arguments cannot be broken. But before I go to break, like a circus barker sitting in a dunk tank, I'm daring you. I don't know if you can hear this. I'm scratching the bottom of my chin. I dare you. I'm pointing at my chin. I dare you. I dare you to try to take these points on if you're a progressive. If you're a college kid, you're an academic, you're a socialist, you're a liberal. I dare you to attempt to prove me wrong. That the single path and the Great Leap Forward led to mass genocide. You want some? I dare you to come get some. SiriusXM Patriot.